Battle of Jericho is one of the most well-known and dramatic stories in the entire Bible. It describes the miraculous conquest of the ancient Canaanite city of Jericho by the Israelites under the leadership of Joshua. This event is not only a pivotal moment in the biblical narrative of the Israelites' journey to the Promised Land, but it is also rich with profound spiritual symbolism and meaning. In the book of Joshua, chapter 6, we read the detailed account of how the Israelites, after crossing the Jordan River, came to the city of Jericho, which was strongly fortified and posed a significant obstacle in their path. The Lord instructed Joshua to have the people march around the city once a day for 6 days, with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant and blowing trumpets. On the 7th day, they were to march around the city 7 times, and then the priests were to blow the trumpets, at which point the people were to shout, and the walls of Jericho would miraculously collapse, allowing the Israelites to surge in and conquer the city. This dramatic sequence of events has captivated the imaginations of believers for centuries, and there is a wealth of spiritual insight to be gleaned from studying it closely. One of the central themes that emerges is the idea of faith, trust, and obedience in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. The Israelites, fresh from their miraculous crossing of the Jordan River, now faced the towering walls of Jericho, a formidable obstacle that must have seemed insurmountable from a human perspective. Yet, the Lord instructed them to adopt a rather unusual strategy: simply march around the city, with no immediate signs of progress. This demanded a deep level of faith and trust in God's plan, even when it defied conventional military wisdom. The people of Israel had to lay aside their own preconceptions and expectations, and simply follow the divine instructions to the letter. This required an unwavering commitment to obedience, even when the outcome was not entirely clear. They had to trust that God knew what He was doing, and that His plan would ultimately prevail, no matter how improbable it seemed. This theme of faith, trust, and obedience is a recurring motif throughout the Bible, and the Battle of Jericho is a powerful illustration of its importance. The Israelites' willingness to follow God's instructions, even when they did not fully understand the reasoning behind them, demonstrates the kind of radical trust and submission that the Lord desires from His people. In our own lives, we often face situations that seem just as daunting and impossible as the walls of Jericho. We may be confronted with challenges that defy our own abilities and resources, and we may be tempted to rely on our own strategies and solutions. But the example of the Israelites at Jericho reminds us that true victory often comes not through our own strength or ingenuity, but through our willingness to surrender to God's plan and to follow His instructions, even when they don't make immediate sense to us. Another powerful spiritual theme that emerges from the Battle of Jericho is the idea of holiness and consecration. The Lord's specific instructions to the Israelites included details about the role of the priests and the Ark of the Covenant, which was to be carried by the priests as they marched around the city. The Ark was a symbol of God's presence and holiness, and its inclusion in the military strategy underscores the profound spiritual dimension of this battle. The priests, as the mediators between God and the people, played a crucial role in this event. They were tasked with carrying the ark and blowing the trumpets, which were used to signal the people when to shout. This responsibility underscores the importance of holiness and consecration in the context of spiritual warfare. The Israelites were not just engaged in a physical battle, but a spiritual one as well. The walls of Jericho represented not only a physical barrier, but also a spiritual stronghold that needed to be broken down. The presence of the ark and the involvement of the priests served as a reminder that this was a battle that was being waged on both the physical and spiritual planes. In our own lives, we too are engaged in a constant spiritual battle, as we seek to overcome the powers of darkness and to advance the kingdom of God. Just as the Israelites needed the priests and the Ark of the Covenant to lead the way, we too need to be consecrated and set apart for the Lord's use, ready to engage in the spiritual warfare that is necessary for us to claim the victory that God has promised. The number symbolism in the Battle of Jericho is also rich with spiritual significance. The Israelites were instructed to march around the city once a day for 6 days, and then 7 times on the 7th day. The number 7 is a significant symbol in the Bible, representing completion, perfection, and the divine. The fact that the Israelites were instructed to march around the city 7 times on the 7th day is a powerful illustration of the way in which God's timing and plan often operate according to a different logic than our own. From a human perspective, the idea of marching around the city for 7 days might have seemed like a waste of time and resources. But God's plan was not bound by the constraints of human logic or efficiency. Instead, the number symbolism points to the fact that God's timing is perfect, and that His plan is designed to bring about a specific outcome that aligns with His divine purposes. The number 7 represents the completeness of God's work, and the fact that the walls of Jericho fell on the 7th day is a powerful testimony to the way in which God's sovereignty and power triumph over the obstacles that we face. In our own lives, we often struggle with the seemingly slow pace of God's work, and we may be tempted to try to rush ahead or to take matters into our own hands. But the example of the Battle of Jericho reminds us that God's timing is perfect, and that His plan is designed to accomplish something far greater than we can imagine. The significance of the number 6 in this story is also worth considering. The Israelites marched around the city for 6 days, and it was not until the 7th day that the walls collapsed. The number 6 is often associated with human weakness and imperfection, as it falls short of the divine perfection represented by the number 7. In the biblical narrative, the number 6 is sometimes used to represent the limitations of human effort and the need for divine intervention. For example, in the creation story in Genesis, God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th day, indicating that human work and effort can only go so far, and that true rest and fulfillment come from God alone. In the context of the Battle of Jericho, the 6 days of marching around the city without any visible progress can be seen as a metaphor for the limitations of human effort and the need for divine power to bring about true victory. The Israelites had to trust in God's plan and follow His instructions, even when it seemed like their efforts were in vain. This theme of the sufficiency of divine power over human weakness is a central part of the biblical message, and the Battle of Jericho is a powerful illustration of this truth. As we face the challenges and obstacles in our own lives, we too are called to trust in God's plan and to rely on His power, rather than trying to solve our problems through our own strength and ingenuity. Another significant spiritual theme in the Battle of Jericho is the idea of the consecration and destruction of idolatry. The city of Jericho was a stronghold of pagan worship and idolatry, and its conquest by the Israelites represented the triumph of the one true God over the false gods of the Canaanites. The instructions given to the Israelites by God included specific commands about the disposition of the spoils of the city. They were not to take any of the plunder for themselves, but were instead to devote it to the Lord, with the exception of the precious metals, which were to be brought into the treasury of the Lord's house. This command underscores the importance of consecrating the fruits of victory to the Lord, rather than trying to keep them for ourselves. The Israelites were called to recognize that the victory they had achieved was not their own, but was the work of God, and they were to honor Him by dedicating the spoils of the battle to His service. In a similar way, the destruction of the city of Jericho can be seen as a metaphor for the need to root out and destroy the idolatry and false worship that can so easily creep into our own lives. Just as the Israelites were called to conquer and destroy the physical walls of Jericho, we too are called to tear down the spiritual strongholds of sin and unbelief that can hold us captive. This theme of the destruction of idolatry is a recurring one throughout the Bible, and it reminds us of the importance of maintaining a pure and undivided devotion to the one true God. When we allow other things to take the place of God in our lives, we open ourselves up to the kind of spiritual bondage and oppression that the people of Jericho experienced. The Battle of Jericho, therefore, serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of consecrating ourselves and our possessions to the Lord, and of rooting out any form of idolatry or false worship that may have crept into our lives. As we engage in our own spiritual battles, we can draw strength and inspiration from the example of the Israelites, who trusted in God's plan and were ultimately victorious over the forces of darkness. Finally, the Battle of Jericho also contains powerful symbolic imagery that points to the larger redemptive story of the Bible. The city of Jericho, with its towering walls and formidable defenses, can be seen as a metaphor for the spiritual forces of evil and oppression that stand in the way of God's people and His plan for their salvation. Just as the Israelites had to trust in God's plan and follow His instructions in order to conquer Jericho, so too must we trust in the power of God's redemptive work in our own lives. The walls of Jericho, which seemed impenetrable from a human perspective, ultimately crumbled before the power of God's presence and the obedience of His people. In a similar way, the spiritual strongholds that hold us captive can only be broken down through the power of God's grace and the surrender of our own will to His plan. Just as the Israelites had to march around the city and trust in God's timing, so too must we be willing to wait upon the Lord and to follow His lead, even when the path ahead seems unclear. The imagery of the collapsing walls of Jericho also points to the larger theme of the destruction of the forces of evil and the establishment of God's kingdom. Throughout the Bible, we see the repeated pattern of God's people facing opposition and oppression only to be delivered and set free through the power of God's intervention. In the case of Jericho, the destruction of the city was a significant step in the Israelites' journey to the Promised Land, and it foreshadowed the eventual triumph of God's people over the powers of darkness and the establishment of His eternal kingdom. As we reflect on the Battle of Jericho, we can see that it is not just a historical event, but a powerful metaphor for the spiritual battles that we all face in our own lives. The themes of faith, trust, obedience, holiness, and the destruction of idolatry all speak to the deeper realities of the Christian life, and they remind us that our ultimate victory is not dependent on our own strength or abilities, but on the power and sovereignty of our loving and gracious God.